Mental Maps is brought to you by Well. Well is a virtual holistic mental health service providing psychiatric evaluations, holistic interventions, and when needed, medication management. For more information, check out Well at www.arukawell.co. That's www.arukawell.co. Welcome back to Mental Maps. As always, I hope this finds you well no matter what season of life you're in. Today is a really special episode because we have been joined by neurologist, neuroscientist, a leader in this field, Masud Husain. Masud, welcome.
Thanks, Josh. Amazing to be here.
We are so glad to have you because the work you're doing, you have a book that's about to be coming out, or it may be out now based on when this episode is released, but it's called Bains Our Selves. And we're going to get into that. But before we get into that, you have done a lot of work in the brain space and primarily letting it lean over and connect into this world of mental health. So tell us a little bit about what some of the knowledge that you've found in connecting the neurology with what we call like mental health.
Yeah, sure. I'm a professor of neurology and cognitive neuroscience here at the University of Oxford. And unusually, I work both in neurology, in neuroscience, but also I'm talking to you today from the Department of Psychology. And they don't usually allow too many neurologists in here. So my work spans the stuff from clinical neurology all the way to basic fundamental psychology. And I think that's important because it gives you a bigger and a wider perspective. So the kind of work I started off doing was looking at the effects of focal injury to the brain. And the kind of focal injury we were looking at were people who were unfortunate to have stroke. Now, our interests were twofold. One is to try and understand some of the mechanisms that go wrong in people who have cognitive disorders after stroke. Some people are interested in looking at language disorders. My particular interest was in attention, how people lose attention and can develop a profound inattentive syndrome after having stroke. So we tried to understand some of those mechanisms, but perhaps more importantly for the patients, we tried to develop some new treatments which might target the brain chemicals that need to be boosted in order to improve their attention. And it turns out, for example, that attention is not one thing. There is selective attention, and that is really required by most animals, including humans, because we're bombarded by information, visual, auditory, tactile. This pullover on me is rubbing on me all the time, but I don't want to know about every little touch. I want to prioritize what's important. So I need to select the stuff that's important. And to do that, I use what we would call selective attention to gate in the stuff that's important and filter out the stuff that's not important. But there's also staining attention. You can see that in little children. They find it really hard to hold onto something for more than a few seconds. They're distracted, they go off somewhere else. And it turns out there is a brain mechanism in you and me that develops over childhood that allows us to keep our attention sustained over long periods of time. And then there, of course, are other types of attention, like divided attention, or perhaps what we might call executive control over attention, which means that some things you can allow to do routinely when, for example, you're driving, you're hardly paying a huge amount of attention to simple things like where your foot is and all the rest of it. But there are other things which, when they come along and are not routine, you really have to devote your resources, your attention to those things. So that's where we started. But our work in that space also led to disorders of motivation, because as I describe in this book, Our Brains Our Selves, with a particularly poignant case, a young man who loses motivation following their stroke, which affects very, very key regions in the brain, the basal ganglia. So we've looked at attention, we've looked at motivation and loss of motivation, which can lead to apathy. And more recently, those learnings from people with those sort of focal brain injuries has led to us applying these concepts to people with other types of brain disorders, particularly people with neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia or Parkinson's disease. Because the way we work is we're trying to understand the brain systems that might be dysfunctional if someone is not paying enough attention or is losing motivation, and seeing whether we can boost those functions in those patients, but seeing also whether we can learn something about ourselves. That's why the book's called Our Brain Ourselves, because we want to understand how those cognitive functions create ourselves.
Mm. Man, that's so cool. So I think before we get into like a lot of this like nitty gritty, for a long time in psychiatry or even just in mental health altogether, there was like this really distinct difference between brain and mental health for whatever reason, right? Like you
Yeah.
don't see the brain guys get over in the neuro world, and very rarely would you see the neuro guys get in the brain world. Why do you
Yeah.
think that existed, and how did that get destroyed, if you will, over the last maybe 20, 30 years, specifically in the last 20 to 30 years?
Okay. I mean, if you want to go historical here, Josh, we can go back to René Descartes, the famous philosopher, and he made this distinction between brain and mind. So for him, mind was an immaterial thing.
Mhm.
It didn't exist in the brain, which was a physical entity.
Mhm.
So he had this dualism. He divided brain from mind. Mind could exist independently of brain. Now, that's quite hard for us to think about in the world we live in. Right? We've grown up with science. We've grown up thinking about, well, surely the mind is created by the brain. But those traditions actually have had a historical influence because, over many years, people developed interests in what they would call the mind, and other people developed interests in looking
Mhm.
under the microscope to neurons and brain tissue and trying to figure out how brains might work. Now, of course, modern day neuroscientists, psychologists, neurologists, psychiatrists, most of us would think that our minds, our mental states are created by the brain. But it's interesting that this dualism goes back hundreds of years, and it probably did lead to different ways in which people thought about the mind as being different from brain. And there are, of course, still people, mental health professionals, who don't like to think that everything can be reduced to a mechanistic, organic basis. And that reductionism, trying to explain everything with molecules, is not necessarily helpful for when you're trying to treat or help an individual, because everyone is different. So, okay, yes, minds might be created by brains, but that isn't going to tell me much about this mind and how I might need to help it.
And I think that's what makes your work so interesting is that, in the world of mental health, as we've kind of brought it all back together, one concept that continues to find itself kind of on the outside is personality and the self,
Mm,
right?
mm,
We can throw neurochemicals in there. We can say this is depression or this is anxiety or this is impulse control. But some of the work you've been doing is trying to connect the self and who you are with some of these neurobiological underpinnings. And so what does
yeah.
that mean? And what have you seen that kind of creates that?
Well, I think we should start with talking about what is the self, right? Because
Mhm.
people speak about the self, and there are hundreds of books, lots of work published on this. And you could think in a simplistic way that the self might be equate to the body. You know,
Mhm.
there's Josh, there's Masud here. We occupy different bodies. That's why we're different selves. But as many philosophers, like the English philosopher John Locke, argued, okay, imagine that Josh's consciousness and Masud's consciousness could swap over bodies. Who would people say occupied Masud's body then? Because the person in here would have all the memories of Josh. They'd speak like Josh. They'd have all his biases and interests and everything else. Surely the self is where consciousness would reside, right? And so that's brought a lot of people in the last century to start thinking about, okay, if we're talking about the conscious state, that surely is an emergent property of a constellation of interacting brain systems, what Marvin Minsky, one of the pioneers of AI from MIT, used to call a society of mind.
Mm.
Our mind is created by the activities of these different cognitive processes: memory, attention, language, motivation, whatever you like, perception. All of these things are what we call the self. And the
Mm.
reason Josh is different from Masud isn't just because he occupies a different body. His identity is not just physical, it's also a mental continuity over time. So that is one factor, this mental continuity over time, which are all the experiences Josh has had in his life, the way he's been brought up, the way he's lived, where he's been, all these things create Josh. And he is a continuum of mental states over that time. And that's one of the key things that people consider to be defining the self. So in addition to physical identity, there could be this identity of the self that emerges from our brain activities and gives us mental continuity. And finally, the other real feature that people have discussed about the self is the social self. So what also defines you is the connections you have with other people, your family, your friends, your colleagues, students, whoever it is. And that's also a unique network of people where Josh is a unique node. So if
Mm.
we use physical identity, if we use mental continuity over time, if we use social identity, these three factors emerge in most of the discussions about the self. And I suspect that most of us would think, yeah, well, all of those things are actually important in defining who we are. And I think that's quite a good way to think about the self. Now, of course, other philosophers, like the British philosopher David Hume, for example, famously said, well, you're just kidding yourselves. There isn't really a self. This is
Mm.
an illusion that we like to
Mm.
have about who we are. And Daniel Dennett, who's an American philosopher who sadly died last year, his take on it was, well, we kind of create a story. There is a
Mm.
self. This is myself. I'll tell you about myself. And that narrative about the self is important in defining us. But he said, you're never going to put your finger on, you're never going to be able to look at the self, because it's like trying to find the center of gravity of an object. It
Mm.
isn't something you can touch, but it exists. And that existence is something that for most of us, we create a story, a fiction, if you will, of who we are. So for him, it was not only that the self emerged from these cognitive processes, but in a way, we were telling ourselves a story that defined how we thought of ourselves.
Mm. And I think so much too, when you think of the self, especially in our culture today, we think about how much external factors impact the self, right? And so I love how you talked
Mm.
about like the whole concept of if I'm in your body, you're in my body. This is going to sound very philosophical to our listeners, but I think also in that component, how does that go when maybe it's a specific news outlet or it's a specific influencer that's constantly filling our brain with the way to think and the information? Does oneself
Mhm.
become that self? Or am I still Josh, even though the templates that I'm being given to view the world are
Yeah.
from whatever?
Yeah. No, I hope you remain Josh. Uh, but obviously we are biased by all sorts of things. We're
Mhm.
biased by advertisements. We're biased by our family members. Our parents probably biased us in the way we think about the world. The people who taught us had some biases. Social influences can bias us. So I think we shouldn't just pick on them, as it is our ability to take that information, and it's up to us what we do with it. We might go, oh, that's
Mhm.
just rubbish. I don't believe
Yeah.
that, right? Or we might say, that's exactly what I think. And it just kind of promotes the way we think about the world. But I don't think they are in any way special, if we were thinking about categories of what can influence ourselves, because we have lots of influences on ourselves.
Mm. I think that is huge, right? Because I think for a lot of people, whether they have a family member or themselves are kind of struggling with consuming information or whatever that looks like, what you're saying is the self remains the same. It's just the biases and the information and all the templates that you get to view that. And so ultimately, you are you, even if you're consuming all this stuff, you just have to choose what you're choosing to believe and not to believe, which ultimately impacts the self.
Yeah. I mean, your identity as an individual remains, but actually, of course, selves change.
Hmm.
As you grow up from being a baby, through teenagers to a young adult to older ages, selves change, not only physically, but also in terms of their mental attributes. So a self is not static. And
Hmm.
one of the themes of the book is the fact that how we belong to our social connections is determined not only by your mental states, right? Your physical identity, if you will, in that way that the brain creates, but it's also your social identity. And it it takes time and effort and cognitive abilities to start to belong to a community. Now, if you move to a different part of the United States, you don't know anybody, you start afresh, it's quite hard to make new connections. You could do it through colleagues, you could do it through clubs, you could do it through sports, whatever it is, but it takes time and effort. And also, of course, if you speak differently, like me, you're going to be also thought of as a bit of an outsider, right? If you're
Hmm.
coming to a community like that, so it would take me a while, perhaps many years, to feel comfortable, and for other people to feel comfortable
Hmm.
with me. Um, so belonging takes time, but what I might call unbelonging, losing that sense of belonging, can occur very rapidly with brain disorders.
Mm.
And that's one of the themes of this book is that um, all that work you put in to belonging can be undone very rapidly by losing just one of your very basic fundamental cognitive abilities. So if you stop paying attention, that can have an impact on how people view you. They might
Mm.
shun you because they think you're not really paying them much attention, or they might find you embarrassing, as one of the cases in the book that I described, because he keeps knocking things over because he's not paying attention visually to what's around him. Or if you lose your motivation, people who depend on you might think, okay, I really can't stand this guy anymore because he doesn't do anything. And, he's not really contributing. And therefore, you may lose those connections that you had. So unbelonging can also occur
Mm.
because of a change in yourself. And this can be very dramatic with a neurological brain disorder that can occur suddenly, like a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, but it can creep up on people who are developing neurodegenerative conditions, like Alzheimer's
Mm.
disease, Parkinson's disease. So it's actually sometimes difficult for someone to see that themselves. Know thyself is all very well saying that, but actually it's very hard to have that insight all the time.
Mm. And so you're saying too that in many of these disorders, whether it is a true like organic brain dysfunction, brain injury, or
Yes.
that it's also, what we call like an organic like mental health problem, whatever, however we want to categorize it, the
Mm.
self can become unwell or the self becomes damaged. And how does
Yeah,
that
the self.
occur?
Yeah, well, the self becomes different, and the way I think about it is that we said that one way we can think about the self is it's an emergent property of brain activity, right?
Hmm.
If you're a fundamental neuroscientist, that's how you'd put it. And that emergent property is because of this society of mind, if you like, a society of cognitive modules, language, attention, perception, motivation, whatever it is, that create yourself. But imagine if one of those modules were to be taken away or disrupted. Imagine that you no longer could speak properly. You became aphasic. Or imagine that you lose concepts about the world, as happens in people who develop semantic dementia. They can speak fluently, but they start losing understanding of the meaning of objects and people.
Hmm.
What do these things actually mean?
Hmm.
So going back to your question, Josh, the way the self would change if you have a brain disorder is if even one of these cognitive modules, which contributes to the emergent property of the self, is taken away. And the case I make in the book is that you need only one of these things to be disrupted, and that can have a major impact on your identity,
Mm,
including your social identity, how you belong. Because it's not just simply that you can't speak. If you can't speak properly, you lose that sense of community you had with people who you used to be able to communicate with well. Um,
mm,
so it has huge knock-on effects beyond just simply the fact that one of these cognitive modules is down,
mm.
right? It has this huge knock-on effect on the connections you have with other people.
And so as the and I think that that's something that's really important because we do live in a society right now that we have an epidemic of dementia, whatever that looks like, and there's a zillion reasons why, and we're not going to get into that. And then we see stroke and we see some of these other like true like brain injuries that occur, traumatic brain injury, something especially here in America that's a hot topic. So there's all these different components of like damaging and hurting the brain, and so within that as an ability gets removed or as something is like taken away, the self becomes damaged, which then impacts your ability to be in community and tribe and all those kind of things. So if
Mm.
that's the driver in that, how does that then lead into maybe depression or anxiety? Is it truly like the brain is damaged, or is this more to do with the concept of belonging?
Yeah, I mean, those are very, very big problems. If we're talking about people who don't have an organic brain disorder like a
Mhm,
stroke or traumatic brain injury, but who have become depressed or
mhm,
developed pathological anxiety, of course, a neuroscientist would still say that must be due to something that's changed in their brains because
mhm, mhm,
these symptoms weren't there before. There must be a different mental state. How do you get a different mental state? It's because the neurons are working differently. The problem has been, of course, that although it's very easy with a brain scan to identify a stroke or perhaps show changes that occur in a neurodegenerative condition or traumatic brain injury, it has been incredibly difficult to show consistent changes in depression or anxiety. They have been shown, and there are emerging there's an emerging sort of consensus in some of these areas, but it has been very, very difficult because usually you don't see structural changes in the brain. What you might do is show that there are changes in activity in the brain, and that has certainly been done. And what has happened is people have tried to look at the regions of the brain which show different activity
mhm,
in people who are depressed or anxious compared to people who aren't, and said, look, these areas are not random areas. They are areas that might be also involved in certain brain circuits, which are important, let's say, for emotional regulation or motivation, because it turns out, you know, people who can develop low mood or become pathologically depressed also lack motivation to do things. Some of them also develop anhedonia, lack of pleasure that they
mhm,
might get from doing something. And finally, one should also say that some people lose the motivation to seek something pleasurable. So this is a very complicated area. I mean, if you look at how psychiatrists can make a diagnosis of depression, it turns out that you need at least one of the two key factors, right? Which is either anhedonia, lack of pleasure, or effectively low mood. But
mhm,
in addition, you need several other symptoms, as you know. And it turns out there are more than 200 permutations of these symptoms, which could give you a clinical diagnosis of depression. So it's a complex area, and one might well say that we really don't have a very good understanding of depression if we're going to say there are more than 200 ways in which it could manifest.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the greatest challenges in psychiatry and in mental health altogether is that there's so many different ways that it shows. We can have hyper excitable depression, hypo excitable depression. You see people who are irritable, and then others who are down. But one of the things I think that you kind of highlighted on is that in psychiatry and mental health, we just can't see everything, and so because of that, something that's gotten
Mm,
really popular, especially when you go back to the work of Shackler in the 50s and kind of how all that movement occurred and the concept of the creation of these antidepressants is
mm,
neurotransmitters and how we really took the concept of a neurotransmitter, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and really let that fly the flag. And I know some of the work that you do is shown some of these neurotransmitters do a lot more than just make us feel good, right? And I think one of those is dopamine. So, what has your work
yeah.
kind of shown as a neuroscientist how dopamine correlates not only with depression, but just your brain?
Yeah. So to link to just what we were talking about now about depression and lacking motivation, one of the ways in which our work has sort of contributed to this sort of area is to say, okay, what about people who suddenly develop a brain disorder? Can we then learn from them about the brain systems that are involved? So to make this more concrete, uh, I saw this guy, David. David is a man in his 30s who unfortunately had a small stroke. He was highly productive at work, very, very sociably able, very gregarious, liked by a lot of people. He had this stroke. It turned out it wasn't one, it's actually two. It turned out there were two tiny little strokes in the basal ganglia, deep in the heart of the brain, these nuclei. And he recovered physically within a week, back to work, but he was completely different. The people around him didn't recognize him because he barely did anything. He couldn't be bothered. They thought he was depressed. They sent him to his general practitioner, GP, we call them here, and he thought, okay, I'll try him on an antidepressant. It didn't do a thing because actually David was not depressed. What he had developed was pathological apathy from these two tiny strokes, not as a reaction to the stroke, but because of the stroke taking out the circuits that link the basal ganglia to the cortex. And these circuits are really crucial to linking motivation signals to action. And because this circuit was broken, motivation was not leading to action. In
Mm,
fact, he just looked inert, very little. He got fired from his job, but he couldn't be bothered to get social security benefits. His friends said, okay, well, you can't afford to pay the rent. You can come and stay with us for a while if you like. And within days, they regretted it because this man did nothing. He sat in his chair all day long and just waited for his friends to come back home, cook for him, clean the house, do everything else. So you could imagine that got very annoying for them. This man who just does nothing. And he was also not looking after himself. He wasn't having a shower. He wasn't really looking after how he was. And so his GP sent him to us. Now, he didn't make any of the appointments to begin with because he couldn't be bothered.
mm,
So I had to phone him up, really persuade him. When he finally got there, he wasn't depressed. He was quite happy. And I said, but you haven't got a job. You're living with your friends. I said, well, they're okay with it. They don't mind. And, I'm happy. I don't mind that. So what do you do all day? Well, I just sit there. But what would you have done before the stroke if you were just sitting on a chair? Oh, I'd have listened to some music. Why aren't you listening to any music now? Because it would take me time to put my music system together. How long would it take? 5 minutes, right? He could not be bothered to put in the effort to get the reward of listening to the music because 5 minutes worth of work was too much. And I had never seen anything like this. This is really profound apathy in a man who is otherwise cognitively very able. He passed all the neuropsychological assessments. He's not weak. He's not depressed. He just could not be bothered to do this. And so we got to thinking about the circuitry that had been taken up by his stroke. And that was in the basal ganglia. And it turns out The basal ganglia are very old. They go back to the lamprey. I think you have the lamprey in the rivers in the States too, but it's a 360 million year old animal that is it's like an eel, and it's the oldest vertebrate around, and it is the oldest creature, the vertebrate with basal ganglia. And for the lamprey, the basal ganglia link motivation signals like finding prey, having sex, these kinds of things, to action. Those motivation signals get to action, and the key neurotransmitter is dopamine. Dopamine is a really important chemical. Neurons speak to each other through neurotransmitters. Dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters. Dopamine is a key neurotransmitter in the basal ganglia of lampreys, and the basal ganglia of humans. So with that knowledge, we decided to treat David, the patient, with a drug that increases the amount of dopamine. It's actually a drug that was used originally for Parkinson's disease. It's a drug that, if you watch the film Awakenings, Oliver Sacks uses to treat people who've got a form of Parkinsonism. That did very little for David, and we were about to give up, thinking it hasn't worked. But then we thought, okay, there's another drug that we use that targets dopamine receptors. Let's use that. And to our surprise, 3 months later, this man, who really wasn't looking after himself, was going nowhere, appeared in the waiting room. I didn't recognize him because he was in a suit. He'd had his hair cut specially, he told me, because he'd been to a job interview, he'd got a job, and most remarkable, he had a new girlfriend, because he wasn't seeing anybody, at that time. So I suddenly thought, wow, here is a case where these two tiny strokes in the brain extinguish this man's motivation, but not his mood. And then we could restore that using a drug that we already had that targets the dopamine system. Now, that was a real revelation for us. And it started off, what's been 20 years of research in this area. Because although David is extremely rare, he is a lesson for us all, because he's shown us how these systems in what was a healthy brain before must have been very important for guiding motivation. And what we found is that in other conditions, like Alzheimer's disease, like vascular dementia, like Parkinson's disease, if this system is being nibbled away at by that pathology, which is different in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or vascular dementia, doesn't matter what the pathology is, but if that brain circuit is being degraded slowly over time, what you're going to get is apathy. And that turns out to be a third of patients with Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Parkinson's disease, for example, develop apathy. It creeps up on them. And you will be very surprised, Josh, that many of their relatives can cope with the fact, okay, he's got Alzheimer's disease, he can't remember things well. But what they find very annoying is someone who won't help take the trash out, or clean up at home, or do anything to contribute to the domestic life of their spouse. So David had changed in terms of his personal identity, but he'd also changed in terms of his social identity. He'd become a different person. Now, in this particular case, we were delighted because we could restore both the kind of motivated individual he was and his connection to his friends through this drug. We're not always so lucky, but it's a real lesson that might be possible, not only for other conditions that seem very difficult to treat at the moment.
There's so much in that, Masood. I think that when you think about that as well, like how many times in Alzheimer's does someone come in and they're not doing these things, and it's just like, well, failure to thrive. They're just having an existential crisis because of that. But
Yeah.
really, you're saying these are brain circuits that are not working well, and ultimately can be changed. But as we kind of talk about that component, you mentioned how increasing dopamine alone didn't fix that problem. And I think that's something that we see a lot, especially in the concept of ADHD and other components, which we're having an epidemic of here in America and in other parts of the industrialized world of nobody can focus, nobody can concentrate. I just need more dopamine. You're saying that many times in brain injuries, as well as with other people, it's less about the chemical and more about the receptor.
It can be, yeah. And
Yeah.
also, these receptors come in different forms. The dopamine receptor isn't one type of receptor. It turns out it's really complex. There are many types of dopamine receptor, and there are many drugs which target these receptors differentially.
Hmm.
They're also obviously used in psychiatric practice in mental health conditions as well. And of course, there can be a downside to some of these drugs. If you have too much of it,
Hmm.
it can also cause perhaps impulsivity,
Hmm.
which we're very familiar with. Um, and in other conditions, it can cause psychosis itself if you
Hmm.
give too much of these drugs. So it has to be very careful and carefully done for each individual in terms of dose and what's appropriate.
And you guys are able, like in this neuroscience world, to see where, okay, this is more of a circuit problem compared to maybe this is more of an overall like brain anatomy problem overall, to where maybe it's receptors because you can't see it. Is that one of the ways that you differentiate that of how to decide when to
That's
use these medicines?
Well, I think that's the way people are going in different conditions. We are nowhere near,
Yeah,
you
of
know,
course. Yeah.
understanding all of this because, of course, I've simplified things here to say we're talking about the basal ganglia and the cortex, but it turns out there are several areas of the cortex that are important in this. And of course, the pre-existing state somebody was in before developing this kind of condition is really important. In this case, we knew that he was a highly motivated person, so this was a step change. Whereas, of course, other people might be very different. Their brains might have been less motivated anyway.
Mm,
And in fact, we did a study here in Oxford with Oxford students a few years ago to look at their brains when they were having to make decisions about whether they thought something was rewarding enough to put in the physical effort. I won't go into the details, but essentially we could change the something that we offered them, how much reward they would get,
mhm,
and we could also change the effort they would need to put in, physical effort they need to put in to get that reward. And of course, we found people vary a lot. Some people say, "Oh yeah, I'll do everything. I can do everything. I'll do anything." And there are other people who go, "Oh no, if it's a low reward outcome, I'm not going to put in that effort, especially if it's a high effort, right?" And it turns out that people with apathy are the thing that differentiates people with apathy from the people who are very motivated is not the high reward; it's the low reward. People who are motivated are willing to work for low rewards, whereas the people who are
mm,
apathetic are not willing to put in the effort for low rewards. And we did this study and also scanned their brains in the magnetic resonance imaging scanner to look at the areas of the brain which were active when they made those decisions. Now, it turns out they include the basal ganglia, which we were talking about in David. They include parts of the cortex, which are important in making actions. And that's the case for all people. But what
mhm.
really surprised us was that the people who are least motivated, the people who are most apathetic in our healthy students, actually activated those brain areas more. It was almost like it was more costly for them to make that decision, right? To
Mm.
decide whether this is worth it
Mm.
or not. They were actually putting in a lot more brain effort. And that really surprised us. But then we got to thinking, well, maybe the reason that happens is it is more costly for some people because brain effort requires sugar, glucose to fuel it. And maybe that's why some people just say, oh, no, I just can't be bothered. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to put the effort into deciding whether this is worth it or not. I just won't do it. The extreme case in David, my patient, he just wasn't bothered to put in the effort to listen to the music because
Mhm.
he didn't think that was worth it. You know?
Mm. It makes me think, you know this way better than I do, but the brain itself is always deciding how much resources to use, right? And ultimately, it's not going to use its resources for something that's not going to have a good payoff. And so, what you're saying is that for some people, especially if you
Mm.
may have some dopamine experiences going on, if that reward's pretty low, is not going to put in the resources for it because it's just going to take so much resource alone to do it.
Yeah.
Where the other person, they're going to take the trash out. They don't care. But for another person, it's going to be very challenging for the brain to be like, why does it work?
Yeah, you might as well be a couch potato because you can think, yeah, I'll just sit here because this isn't going to be worth it, the effort taking the trash out. Somebody else will do that. I'm sure
Mm,
many people know that kind of person. But actually, what we were surprised about was you could find differences in the brains of people who are very motivated and people who are not so motivated amongst us, not people who've got brain disorders,
yeah.
amongst.
Yeah. And I think, when we think about it, just kind of stay in this line of dopamine, there's this huge discussion of attention and focus and all the components that kind of go with that. And there has
Mm.
been this concept that's kind of emerged where people who struggle with attention or focus, whether they found compensatory ways to manage it or not, really struggle to do things that they don't want to do. And it creates a lot of like societal challenges for them. But what you're kind of sharing is that if that's where your brain's at, it just takes too much energy, too much resources to do those menial things, and that's why they struggle so much to do them.
Yeah, and of course, I'm not suggesting everybody needs dopamine or anything like that. I'm just
No.
saying actually realizing that can make a difference because, for example, you might say, I can't go around making all these decisions. It's too much. The burden's too much on a daily basis. But what happens if you were to plan ahead for the week, right? If you won't have to, if you've planned things out, then you don't have the burden of on a moment to moment thinking, should I do this or should I do that? You've planned it out. This is what you're doing. It takes away some of the burden of making those decisions on
Mm,
the fly. Or maybe somebody else has planned it out for you if it's really difficult. And that structure is something that's often used in
mm,
therapies, right? So behavioral activation therapies use this sort of thing is here's a routine for you. If you can't really get yourself to do this or structure this yourself, here's your routine. And the reward will be this if you manage to achieve these things in the day, or the reward will be that if you manage to achieve all of this by the end of the week. So
mm,
part of having the structure is also taking away not just the responsibility, but the brain burden of
mm.
creating the decisions about what I should do.
Do you feel that that's really important in the concept of if your brain's in a place of either not feeling well or something's going on, that ensuring that there's structures there can really help with the healing because it decreases the impact of the brain trying to make decisions and all of those things?
I think that's, well, I'm not sure people have framed it like that, but I think that's effectively what's happening when people go to rehab of whatever kind. But let's say you've had a brain disorder. If you go to a rehab unit, part of the thing is, look, here is the goal that we're trying to achieve this week. How are we going to do that? It could be physical therapy, it could be occupational therapy, it could be something else, speech therapy if that's required. But effectively, that is planned out for you. You're not having to make those decisions. And of course, you experience them and you can get improvements with your therapies. But one of the things you've got is a very structured environment in which you are not left at sea. Someone is saying, this is what we're doing next.
It makes me think, when you think about like William Glasser's choice theory and his five core needs and what that looks like and how we're all attempting to meet these five basic needs, that there may
Mm.
come a point in a brain illness or some kind of experience where just attempting to meet that need alone is so overwhelming that it's got to be structured for them so that health can occur. Whereas I
Yeah.
think a lot of times we're just thinking, give more openness or create more autonomy or just throw your hands up and let them figure it out. But it seems like that's very different in this space.
Yeah, and also it depends who it is, right? Some people
Mm.
might need that autonomy, whereas other people need the structure. But we've been really surprised and interested to find that even something like motivation can potentially be affected by structures like a
Right.
routine. Giving people a routine could make it easier for some individuals. And of course, that's how you start with children, right?
Mhm.
You try to give them a routine when they're young, um,
Mhm.
and it could be as fundamental as going to school and
Mhm.
doing these classes and coming home at this time or going to this club. That's a routine that gives them structure. Imagine a child that didn't have that structure. What would they do?
Mm. Exactly. It makes me think too. I know this happens a lot in America. Like, yeah, I work with a lot of kids, and so I see a lot of kids and different things that kind of come with
Yep.
that. And I think something that's really interesting that you bring up is that we have found this like component of like attention and focus being a problem. At the same time, it's rearing its head primarily in very structured settings, right? So in your academia, in having to sit in class and be calm and all those kind of things. And so, is there a point, I guess, where the structure itself can do more harm than good when you have some kind of brain stuff going on?
Yeah, I think rigidity and inflexibility are not always productive. That's what I mean. You have to realize who you're dealing with and understand the kind of personality. You brought that personality right at the beginning. The kind of personality that you're dealing with um, now, after whatever's happened to somebody, but also what they were like beforehand.
Mhm,
If somebody was really resistant to being told what to do, it's very unlikely that if you impose an incredibly rigid discipline on them in terms of what they have to
mhm,
do, that they'll be accommodating
mhm,
unless you give them incentives, unless you say, look, this is the way you're going to get better. So,
mhm.
you know, please buy into this and see how much you can get from it before you decide that you don't want to be told what to do.
Yeah, and then that brings up that whole case of the motivation component, right? Of like, am I going to be
Yeah.
motivated to do it, and all those things. I think I see that a lot with parents who, like, they're creating
Yeah.
these behavior systems, and the kid doesn't do it, and so they're just so frustrated. But in this instance, if it just takes so much energy to do that, it's just going to be really easy just not to do it, and so then that brings
Yeah.
up a whole gamut of things.
I think there have to be incentives as well. This
Yeah.
just it's the way humans work. So one way of thinking about recognition um, is the potential reward, if I do this, worth the effort? That's the way we framed a lot of the work around this. And it could be physical effort, but it could be cognitive effort. It could be social effort, right? It could be any of these things. But essentially, we're all doing this kind of neuroeconomic weighing up. Is that potential outcome, reward, whatever it is, worth this effort? And
Mhm,
we all
mhm,
have different kind of evaluation systems about what we think is worth it or not. And
mhm,
what we're trying to do, what we've just been talking about, is trying to nudge people to
mhm,
say, yeah, actually, even if you think it isn't worth the effort,
mhm,
it may be, because you could get better if you make that effort.
mm. I love that. So I think, as our listeners kind of take all this information in, I know one of the things that many people are thinking is like, how can I use this information to help myself? Right? Whether like you're struggling in some way or whatever that looks like, what are some of the very like application driven components you've learned from sitting with these people, understanding this research of where people can take some of these core concepts to help their brain?
Well, I think it depends on what the problem is.
Okay.
So we've focused in this conversation on attention and inattention, and we've focused on motivation and apathy. But there are obviously many other things that could be going on here. And if someone's really worried, I think self-diagnosis is not the right thing to do. Even even a medical professional shouldn't be going around making their own diagnosis. You need to talk to somebody like you to try and tease out what the problems are. So my first takeaway is, if you're seriously feeling like you're in trouble in some way, then don't do a self-diagnosis, because a little knowledge is a very dangerous thing. You need to see someone who is regularly seeing people who have these sort of symptoms. The second thing I think really is important is the people around you. It's sort of often still surprising to me how many of the people who come to see me haven't said anything to their family or friends, even if they realize that family or friends have recognized there's a problem. They don't
Mm,
find it easy to explain to them. And of course, many people feel it's a defect to express the fact that you've got a problem, right? We all kind of want to be perfect. So my second takeaway is think about talking to somebody who you might trust and consider getting their opinion about what's going on. But um, if you really don't feel like you're severely affected, but you want to improve something like, let's say, motivation, then maybe it would be worth thinking about how you could reduce the burden that you have in terms of feeling overwhelmed, you know, by planning ahead. Now, of course, just taking the effort to plan is not straightforward, but maybe if you find it difficult, do it with somebody else. Talk it through.
mm,
Might be easy to think, okay, this is the way I'm going to plan my week. And ideally, this is what I'd like to achieve. Now, obviously, if you put in a very, very rigid plan, it's unlikely you're going to be able to achieve this, all of it, in just for someone who isn't normally achieving it. So you have to be realistic, and you also have to have some degree of leeway, some degree of flexibility here in terms of your plan. And I think it would be really worthwhile considering that. The other thing to do is see whether you can offer yourself some rewards about what would be
mm,
achieved if you manage to do all these things. What's the reward you're going to give yourself? And it's not a bad thing to you know give yourself a reward, something positive as an outcome for achieving this. Um, so that would be something I might say was simple you could do for motivation. But for other things, obviously, it just depends what the problem is. It's a complex issue, and some people may have more than one. Some people may be apathetic and inattentive. That's not that rare. You were talking about people who might have ADHD or ADD. That's not rare at all.
mm. I like how you brought up, your first point of there could be so many things going on, and I think that's something that like we get from this conversation is just as someone that spends so much time looking at the brain like you have, you give these cases of people who have had these like brain changes, right? And they create what we call mental health symptoms. And I think it's so important to remember as you're consuming information of a TikTok video or whatever it is about what is depression, there are
Mm,
so many reasons why this occurs.
exactly.
And so
Yeah.
just to grab a supplement or take a medicine or do whatever without truly knowing and setting with someone is an injustice to
Yeah.
yourself. Just like the case you show or you shared, you would imagine someone who's apathetic gets more dopamine now they're doing more stuff. But that's not true
Mm,
because it was a brain circuit problem. And so I think for anyone that's listening to this, if you've got something going on, talk with someone
mm.
to figure out what it is. Because until you know what it is, man, you're just kind of shooting blindly in the bucket. And there's some big issues with that.
You really are, and it's the brain's a complex organ. We barely scratch the surface in really
Yeah.
understanding it. It's
Yeah.
amazing how much we have learnt about it, but people are complicated, and you know, usually it's very, very difficult to work out exactly what's going on unless you see someone who has that professional
Mm.
experience of doing this day in, day
Yeah.
out, and can take the elements of your story and figure out the kinds of problems you're having.
Mm. And I think you also being able to bring in that the self is impacted, right? I love how you kind of talked about that. Maybe even the concept of motivation, you're going to need you're going to need some kind of structure and routine. That's going to come from somebody
Yeah,
else. But if you're not talking to your people, how are they going to know? And so there's this whole gamut of like you
yeah,
as a self, your brain being damaged, and then ultimately helping the community around you kind of lift you up and help you get out of that, which is
yeah.
ultimately how healing occurs.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised. Some communities can be incredibly supportive, and of course, it
Mhm.
depends on the cultural background.
Mhm.
Some of the people I mentioned in the book are immigrants to the United Kingdom from different parts of the world. So one of the people that I mentioned starts to experience visual hallucinations. He sees people in the middle of the night in his room, and that's very frightening. But he can't really tell people. He doesn't really even want to tell his family or friends because the culture that he comes from, if you see visual hallucinations, that means you're possessed. You're
Mm.
possessed
Mm.
by an evil spirit, and therefore people will shun you. Now, it turned out that although he's reluctant to talk to me about it, when I did get that story and when we did examine him and when we did some brain imaging, it turns out he has a condition called Lewy body disease, which can give you visual hallucinations.
Oh.
But we were able to get rid of those hallucinations using a drug that targets the acetylcholine system, a cholinergic drug.
Mhm.
And so we could restore his visual perceptions to normal. He didn't have visual hallucinations. And he didn't feel like he was so embarrassed that he couldn't go and see his friends and family, because if he was to experience one of these hallucinations during the time he was seeing them, that would be so embarrassing. And
Mhm.
that wasn't something he wanted to do. So it also depends on the cultural background in terms of whether a symptom
Mhm.
is acceptable or not. And many of the mental health symptoms that we can now talk about freely weren't talked about so freely
Mm.
20, 30 years ago.
Well, and you take that into account of, you take someone who's having that experience, how easily it is to be like, "Oh, they're psychotic, so here's a dopamine antagonist drug," but you're
Sure,
saying, "Actually, hold on, no, there's something else going on," especially
sure.
in Lewy body dementia,
Yeah.
for sure.
In fact, in this condition, Lewy body disease, it can be actually fatal to
Mm.
give a dopamine antagonist drug. So you got to get that right.
Yeah, I think it's such a great point to make is that, from a neuroscientist, you see where there's all these brain challenges, symptoms can kind of correlate with similar things, and it can look a lot until you know what's going on. It's really challenging. And
Yeah.
hopefully in
So,
psychiatry, we can get to that place.
yeah. So this poor guy thought he was going mad because he was having visual hallucinations. He thought he was going to be put into an asylum, institutionalized, because that's the way he thought about people who might have visual hallucinations and madness. So it's also, you know, educating people about the fact that many of these things are treatable.
Yeah. And two, just because the culture, it doesn't maybe align with culture, it's still an issue and it can be fixed, right? I think we see that a lot, when you think of like tribal communities and it occurs a lot in psychosis. But I think about like Western culture and how just like sadness or
Mm.
lowness or apathy, like you talked about, is such a disdain, like it's such a stain on your character, right? Like you're not hustling, you're not working, you're not doing those things. And so,
Yeah.
really, like many people won't say anything about it because they're just kind of like, white knuckling it through life. But really, you're saying that if you say something, you can create that space. And as a community, if we have an awareness, man, there's some changes that can happen for people.
Yeah, I think there's potential here. There is potential. The cases I've been talking about, a few years ago, people would have said, well, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, I
We are
know.
doing.
Yeah, I like it. Masood, thank you so much for all this information. I know, for our listeners, there's a lot of science in it. There's a lot of good stuff. And so I think as you kind of work through that, those core points you mentioned at the end are really important and good takeaway, just to kind of set on and meditate on. For people who want to follow your work, your book's coming out soon, you have a presence online. How can people follow this work that you're doing?
Yeah, they could go to our website. It's www.masudhusain.org, MASUDHUSAIN.org. That has a lot of information. If you're interested, there are also the publications that we've written on this, the research publications. If you're interested in the principles we've been talking about, the book, Our Brains, Our Selves, comes out in April in the United States. And you might be interested in reading about the ways in which the brain creates our personal identities and our social identities.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on any of your podcast platforms, you'll see those links there. This will be coming out in April, right? So we'll have the link to be able to check out your book and what that looks like when that comes out too. So that'll all be on there. So definitely, follow that. Masood, I know we just kind of scratched the surface of like one thing of all of your specialties, right? But I really enjoyed this conversation, man. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Same here, Josh. Thank you.
Enjoy it. Thank you. Thank you, guys.